Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I feel like when John Kennedy was taking office on January 20th, 1961, he was facing a task that few presidents would have to face. During the 8 years that President Eisenhower would be in office, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had begun to relax a little. That being said, I believe the threat of the Soviet Union was still firmly on the minds of many Americans. Besides the threat of the Soviet Union, John Kennedy also had the unfortunate task of trying to replace three of the greatest presidents this country has ever had: Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower would be especially difficult to follow in the footsteps of, as he had been the supreme commander who had led the Allied forces to victory during World War II, and over the course of 8 years, proven himself to be one of the most capable presidents this country has had. Despite all the pressures he would face going into office, including living up to the expectations of his father, Joe Kennedy Sr., who had essentially groomed John to be president since the death of his oldest brother, I believe Kennedy proved himself to be a worthy successor to the three men he followed, despite his short time in office. Before diving into the presidency of JFK, I think it's important to look back at the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower to see exactly what Kennedy was walking into in 1961. In a lot of ways, Eisenhower comes off to me as the 20th century version of George Washington. Both served in the military for the vast majority of their lives, and both would be asked to lead the nation into the most important wars this country would be in. Eventually, both would serve 2 terms as President of the United States. While Eisenhower had been an accomplished general in his own right, part of the reason he was chosen to lead the Allied forces was because of his ability to get men to work together. Historian Richard Atkinson would say when describing Eisenhower that
Franklin Roosevelt chooses Dwight Eisenhower to be the commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force for the final campaign beginning in Normandy because, as Roosevelt says, he's the best politician among the generals.
Following the events of World War II, Eisenhower had semi-retired from the military. He was still active in some regards, but had taken up a position as president of Columbia University. When it became apparent that President Truman would not seek another term in office, Eisenhower entered politics for the first time in his career, running with California Senator and future President Richard Nixon under the Republican banner. With the popular campaign slogan, "I like Ike," Ike being Eisenhower's nickname from his childhood, and with his immense popularity for leading the Allied forces to victory during World War II, Eisenhower would easily defeat Adlai Stevenson to win the presidency on November 4th, 1952. During the 8 years he would serve as president, many notable domestic affairs would occur under Eisenhower's administration. The National Highway Interstate Act of 1956 was greenlit during Eisenhower's administration, which funded 41,000 miles of interstate to be built throughout the country. Eisenhower would also be instrumental in helping establish the National Aeronautic and Space Administration during his presidency. This is more commonly known today as NASA. The purpose of establishing NASA was to help America combat the Soviet Union in the space race that would occur during the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. Another notable domestic affair that would occur under Eisenhower's administration would occur in September of 1957, when Eisenhower used military force to allow 9 African American students to enter a formerly all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. At first, these students were denied entry in the school. However, Brown v. the Board of Education in 1954 outlawed segregated schools. This forced Eisenhower to send federal troops to Arkansas to escort these students into the school. Later on, these students would be known as the Little Rock Nine. When it came to foreign affairs, Eisenhower oversaw the end of the Korean conflict, but perhaps more notably, Eisenhower was responsible for keeping the Soviet Union at bay, at least maybe momentarily. Since the end of World War II, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had continued to grow. To ensure that no attack would occur on America, Eisenhower allowed for the production of nuclear weapons with the hopes that these weapons would deter any attack. In a lot of ways, this philosophy is similar to Theodore Roosevelt's famous slogan, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Eisenhower didn't want a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, but he needed to make sure that America would not be attacked. Perhaps the production of these weapons only intensified tensions between America and the Soviet Union, but I truly believe Eisenhower did what he believed was best for the country.
Everyone is voting for Jack, 'cause he's got what all the rest lack. Everyone wants to back Jack. Jack is on the right track.
During the 8 years Richard Nixon would spend as vice president, he would not become particularly popular. However, after an unofficial debate with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, which would later be known as the Kitchen Debate, many people's perception of Nixon had changed, and many began to feel that he would be a worthy successor of Eisenhower. However, a little-known politician from New England named John Kennedy would take the presidency instead. Kennedy at the time had only been a politician for about 12 years, so many people felt that he was not ready to be president. However, after some notable celebrities such as Frank Sinatra had voiced their support for Kennedy, and after a successful television debate against Nixon, John Kennedy would be elected as the 35th president on November 8, 1960. While Kennedy would only serve as president for a short period of time, a few major events occurred during his presidency that would help shape the world. The first was the invasion of Cuba, which would later be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. During Eisenhower's administration, communist leader Fidel Castro had taken control of Cuba. The U.S. government felt they could not allow this radical to stay in power, and Eisenhower began plans to overthrow the communist regime. Before the plans could be finalized, Eisenhower left the presidency, which meant that John would have to finish what he started. On April of 1961, John gave his final approval, and the Cuban invasion had begun. Unfortunately, when it became apparent to the rest of the world that the U.S. was behind this invasion, John backed down. John would not allow any additional troops to enter Cuba, which caused the invasion to fail. This ultimately led to Castro's hold on Cuba strengthening. While the Bay of Pigs failure had been a major embarrassment for the United States, it began a series of events that almost ended the world. Castro would ask the Soviet Union to place missiles in Cuba in order to prevent any future attacks. Once the United States discovered these missiles in October of 1962, Kennedy sent a naval blockade around Cuba and told the country that the United States was on the brink of war with the Soviet Union. Over the course of almost 2 weeks, negotiations between Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev occurred, and eventually a truce between the United States and Soviet Union was reached, once Kennedy promised that the United States would not attack Cuba as long as the Soviets promised to remove their nuclear weapons from the island. Behind closed doors, Kennedy would also promise to remove missiles that the United States had in Turkey as well. Because the United States was in the middle of the Cold War during Kennedy's time in office, he was unfortunately unable to get much done domestically. However, in June of 1963, Kennedy issued the Report to the American People on Civil Rights, a speech in which Kennedy outlined his belief that civil rights for African Americans was imperative. Kennedy had hoped to get a civil rights bill passed. However, only 5 months after giving this speech, Kennedy would be dead.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Immediately following the shocking death of John Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson would assume the role of President of the United States on November 22, 1963. The nation was shocked and saddened by the sudden and violent end of Kennedy's life, and it would be up to Johnson to pick up where Kennedy had left off. Despite the shocking circumstances around his presidency, Lyndon B. Johnson would prove himself to be a worthy successor to Kennedy, especially when it came to domestic affairs. One of the first major pieces of legislation that Johnson would sign into law would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based off race, religion, or sex. LBJ's domestic policies were also highlighted by his War on Poverty, in which Johnson enacted federal aid to help raise the average living condition of all Americans. These new policies included the Food Stamp Act of 1964, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, as well as additional funding toward public education. In many ways, these policies were a continuation of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies during the Great Depression. While there are many highlights toward Lyndon Johnson's presidency, many people to this day still remember him for the Vietnam War. After a communist regime had taken control of North Vietnam, Johnson began sending thousands of men to Vietnam to fight this regime. At first, many Americans supported the war, but after years of fighting and little to no progress being made, many started to question Johnson and his presidency. By the time the 1968 presidential elections were starting to be discussed, Johnson decided to forego the election, despite being eligible to run once again. Instead, Johnson would quietly retire to his ranch in Texas, where he would die almost 5 years later, on January 22, 1973. After Johnson had announced that he would not be running once again for the presidency, many notable Democrats were considered to replace him, including John Kennedy's younger brother, Robert. Unfortunately, much like John, Robert would be assassinated on June 6, 1968. With Robert dead, Vice President Hubert Humphrey would be chosen to run against former Vice President Richard Nixon. Ultimately, Nixon would win the election of 1968 on November 5th, almost 8 years to the day that John Kennedy had defeated him back in 1960. Nixon's presidency would ultimately be defined by controversy. but that's a story for another day.